So let's get started. I'll begin by going through the materials that you'll be using for the workshop. If you haven't already done one of these chalk and charcoal before, it's pretty similar to what we use for the charcoal workshop, with a few variations. So I'm going to be working on this grey toned paper. So you want some sort of grey toned paper ideally, or some sort of toned paper of some description. So it could be more like a beige, or any colour really works. But it needs to be something that's a lot greyer than sort of pure white paper. Then for our drawing we'll be using willow charcoal. So I've got nitrum, which is sort of reasonably expensive willow charcoal, but any kind of willow charcoal will work. If you are using nitrum, I'm using the green, which is B, and the orange, which is HB. These are unsharpened, but I'll go through sharpening in a moment. The other drawing implement that you'll need for this workshop is a white chalk pencil of some description. Pretty much any white chalk will work. You could even use white pen, but anything that's sort of just a pure white that you can use to apply tone. I also have a charcoal holder, which isn't actually on the materials list. It's not necessary, but they can be useful. So sometimes you might see me using one of these. Basically, once you get down to the end of your charcoal little nub, it gets difficult to hold and draw. So this just gives you a little bit of an extension away from the piece of charcoal, and particularly for the more expensive charcoal like nitrum, it's nice to have an extender that you can use. For sharpening, you'll need some sort of sharpening block. So this is a homemade one that I've got, just a block of wood with some fine sandpaper attached to it, pretty much. And in this class, you also want something to sharpen your white pencil. So you could use a regular pencil sharpener, but I recommend using a knife, so some sort of X-Acto knife, which you use to basically pare back the wood to sort of expose a longer piece of lead, like white lead, and we'll be able to sharpen that kind of long piece with the block. So we'll go through just now how we sharpen. So I'm just going to hold this roughly up so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm trying to get the paper messy. I'll see what the best angle is, maybe about here. So what you want to do is, using sort of long movements back and forth with the charcoal at a very low angle to the block, you want to kind of work backwards and forwards on each side until eventually you get to a rounded point. And ideally, the longer taper you can get, the better. So if you've got a lot of flat of the charcoal touching the surface of the sandpaper, you'll get a longer point. So I'll demonstrate that now, but I won't talk while I'm demonstrating it because it tends to be really loud. So I'm rotating it. And again. And again. So I've done all four sides now. You can see it's starting to get to a point. Could maybe do it a little bit more. So I'm just going to keep going until it's very fine. And so there you can see that's now a very sharp point. I'll whack my autofocus on and see if you can see up close the sort of taper that we're looking for. Now a longer taper like this will last longer when you're drawing with it. So basically, if you have a blunter sort of point to your charcoal, So if it's less of a kind of fine taper, you'll find it just blunts off quicker. Whereas if you're drawing with something like this, we're going to be drawing in a similar way to how we just sharpened. Just expose back or focus back onto the paper. So we'll be drawing in a similar way. So drawing with the charcoal to a low angle to the paper, and that way, as we draw, we keep it fairly sharp. And we can also spin the charcoal around in our fingers as we're drawing. And then that also kind of replicates the effect of how we sharpened the charcoal. I'm not going to do my HB now, I'll do that later when I'm using it, but we'll do that. You do the same thing with your HB when you're working in HB rather than B. And then just quickly for the white as well, you can have a little section of your block that you use for white, and it's the same thing. You're just kind of slowly spinning the pencil around in your hand. Till you get to a finer point. That's what you're looking for. But yeah, that's pretty much it for materials. You want something to put your charcoal sort of powder in it as well. It's useful to keep your charcoal after you've sharpened it, because you can use the powder for lots of different things. And we're pretty much ready to start drawing then. Just check, got my setup nice and clear. If my exposure goes at any point during the session, let me know as well. Sometimes it kind of goes in and out depending on what I'm drawing, particularly for this this chalk and charcoal workshop, because you do get quite a range of different exposure throughout. But as a general sort of overview of how we're going to begin, we're starting with just a general block in of the overall shape of the head, and then gradually refining into that to develop the features. And then after we've done that, we'll start to block in tones, and we'll start to look at tonal structures. So tonal structures become a little bit different when we're working with chalk, because we're not kind of just gradually making everything darker. We have this mid-tone paper. We're making some parts of it lighter and some parts darker. In the instance of this particular reference, the shirt's very bright, so if we were to copy this perfectly, we probably would only use white chalk in the shirt. But what I want you to do is treat the shirt more as a kind of greyish colour, so just kind of lightly sketched in, and we're going to make the this portion of the head, the lighter parts of the head, into the sort of heightened white chalk. So what we'll end up with is these sorts of shadows on the face will be charcoal. This panel, this plane here, around the forehead, is going to be roughly the value of the paper, and then we're going to be heightening up into these lighter tones. But we'll get there a bit later. At the moment, we're just going to be blocking in general proportions and working with shadows. So to place this drawing, I have to think about how big do I want to make it, and where do I want to position the head. So if I made the head really big, it would feel a bit cramped in the paper. So I'm going to make it sort of probably occupy something like that much of the paper. Maybe if you imagine kind of just under half the paper is usually a good sort of rough sort of guide for how big to make a head within a canvas. And I also want to have a little bit more space on the left of him than on the right. If I put a lot of space on the right, he'd feel a bit cramped up against the left-hand edge of the drawing. So we're going to kind of have his eyes sitting just a little bit, so the back of his head's kind of a bit more towards the right-hand edge to give more space to the left-hand edge. So to place the head, I'm going to use the top of it, including the hair. So we're incorporating the hair into the head in this instance. Sometimes there are different approaches to drawing. Sometimes people work with the skull shape and they build the hair on top. But for this one, we're going to be working with the sort of outside constraints of the head. So the top of where the hair is, the bottom where the chin is, the left-hand edge of the face, sort of the bit that projects out the furthest to the left, which is going to be the nose, I think, and then the back of the head is the bit that projects furthest to the right. So we're starting with just a rectangle that would encapsulate that. So looking at it, we can see it's going to be a slightly taller than wide rectangle. It's not going to be square. And that's one of the first things we're looking for is, if I was to just really simply block in top of the head. So you can see I'm working very lightly there with the charcoal at a very kind of slight angle. Then bottom of the head. Down about there, so very ghosty line, kind of ghosty, sketchy line. Then the left-hand edge of the face, and then I'm going to try to just roughly guess at how wide I think the head would be relative to the height. So if I very lightly block in a rectangle, this is what we're imagining, is kind of this rectangle that's a boundary around the whole head. So I'm trying to see, does that rectangle match the rectangle I'm looking at here? And it doesn't feel too bad, that. I also want to see, am I happy with the placement, and am I happy with the size? And I would maybe say, today I'm going to go reasonably sort of large with the head. So possibly let's push it out just a little bit. So I'll push out the left-hand edge. I'm going to keep this back edge. I'm kind of happy where that is. I think it would go too far to the right if I push that any further out. So I'm going to erase my original line, and I will also drop this chin measurement down a bit as well, and then erase the original line. So there you can see I've just kind of enlarged that rectangle somewhat. So the next thing we want to do is start to sort of give more of a gesture to the general shape of the head. So there is a sort of general angling of different lines from those furthest left points, furthest right points. So for instance, we want to think about where the nose sort of starts to angle back. So the nose is our furthest left point, and we've got this kind of general sloping back line that cuts back to the chin. Then from that point we've got another line that just kind of slopes back up to the forehead, and we're just sort of estimating these lines. We're going to work back into them with more detail momentarily. So that slopes back. Then from the top of the head we've got this line that slopes down to the hair, which roughly is a vertical alignment. So if I was to imagine a line running straight up from the nose, maybe it actually slits slightly to the left, maybe the hair is the furthest left point. Then a little angle back for that. Then we've got our bottom of the jaw, the beard kind of just runs straight across from that bottom of the chin and starts to angle back up towards the back of the head. And then from that high point on the other side we've also got the tilt to the back of the head. And to be honest, this actually doesn't feel super in whack for the actual head. So I need to go in and kind of problem solve a bit and figure out where things are maybe wrong. So this is what you're always doing. So if things aren't perfect, you can always correct them. So I'm not too concerned that it maybe doesn't quite match what I'm looking at. This is the most important stage of the drawing, so I can spend time correcting things, and it's good to kind of have an opportunity to have to do a lot of correction, because this is very often when you're starting drawing the sort of situations that you end up with. So I want to look at the overall kind of width of the head, thinking about where maybe things feel slightly off. It's always a bit trickier with a profile, because you have a lot more kind of, when we're blocking in a head front on it, it is more of a rectangle, and then with the profile you've always got more ins and outs going on in the head. So one thing I feel is the tilt back is maybe too drastic from the where the nose is. So maybe reduce that slightly as the first thing to do. You're giving a bit of thought to how much sort of bulk there is at the back of the head here as well. And I think it might be, maybe I made it slightly too wide generally, so I can kind of trim it down a little bit there. I need a kind of sufficient angling back. Can drop this little neck down, so that's starting to feel a bit better. I feel more comfortable with these proportions. So if you're having trouble, that's the sort of same thing, same process you want to go through. So just nudge things around a bit, try and figure out what seems wrong with them, what you need to change. Maybe project that beard out, that chin out a little bit further as well, because that starts to give more space that we need for the bottom, that kind of bottom angling line. And that's starting to feel a bit better. So I'm just gradually kind of chiseling away at those bigger proportions and adjusting them where necessary. That's the sort of process that we're going for. At this point I can just block in the shoulder, head. And I realise that this little angle I put there feels too low down, so that drops down too low below the jaw, so I want to just lift that back up a bit.